Good day, everyone. I'm Tony Suzuki, and today I'll be discussing one of the most important skills in radio production, how to prepare questions for a radio interview. Whether we're producing a public affairs talk show, a feature program, or a community discussion, well-crafted questions are the heart of every successful interview. So this report, of course, draws primarily from our main text, production and print, and radio development communication materials, as well as some recent literature on broadcast interviewing. And together, the sources that I have gathered highlight one key idea, that radio interviewing is not simply asking questions, but creating clarity, connection, and conversation. Okay, so this report is a continuation of the tips on how to prepare questions for a radio interview. So there are prior tips already on how to prepare questions. So I'll be starting from my first tip, avoid double questions. Okay, so a double question forces the guest to choose which part to answer and often leaves the other half ignored. So for example, they cite, stated in our text, ano pong uri ng protesta ang inyong gagawin at hindi po naman kaya magkaroon ng pagkilos ng pamahalang bayan tungkol dito. So even a cooperative interviewee might forget or skip half of it. So there's like a follow-up question right away, which might confuse them or might make them only answer the first one and eventually forget that there's a follow-up question. So please avoid double questions. And next, so Beaman in 2000 agrees, noting that the interviewer must ask one question at a time, allowing the interviewee space to respond fully. So of course, by separating questions clearly, you not only guide your guest, but also help your listeners follow the flow. So remember, again, our audiences in radio cannot reread or rewind. So they rely on clear, single idea questions. And that's the first tip for me. Next, so the second one for my report, focus on audience relevance. The second rule, so according to our text on my part, it's to keep questions relevant to audience needs. So an interview should not revolve around abstract concepts, but on real life experiences. If you're discussing poverty, ask about the price of rice, food, or rent. So not the macroeconomic theories. So this principle aligns with Media First in 2023, which advises broadcasters to frame questions around audience understanding and concrete examples. In other words, listeners connect more deeply when they can visualize the situation. So something that they can easily relate to and understand. Okay. So for example, in our text, a question like, magkano ba ang isang kilong galunggong ngayon kumpara sa noong isang taon? So it instantly grounds the conversation in a relatable image. So most people in the Philippines probably have experience on buying fish or galunggong as it is. And this is something that majority of the people will be able to understand or relate to. And next, so Grayson in 2018 adds that effective radio communication uses simple, sensory, and concrete language. So because sound alone must carry meaning. In short, relevance turns an interview from an academic discussion into a shared experience between the host, the guest, and the community. Okay. So third, avoid leading questions. So a leading question suggests a specific answer or judgment, often revealing bias. So research on clean language interviewing in 2015 and conversational analysis in 1997 confirms that interviewer bias can distort authenticity. So neutral phrasing allows interviewees to tell their story honestly and builds trust with listeners. So it's essential for credible broadcasting. And for example, on avoiding leading questions. So bakit po kayo pumasok sa politika na napakahirap at magpapahirap sa kalooban ng inyong pamilya? So it implies a negative view of the guest's decision. So it's something that's maybe too personal or something that's not necessary for the audience anymore. So the better version is, ano po ang sabi sa inyo ng inyong mga anak at asawa nang malaman nilang kayo ay kakandidato? So in this question, it invites the guest to share the perspective freely. So maybe on a more positive note, something that can inspire or move even the listeners. And next, so the fourth one for my report, so separate statements from questions. So in our textbook, it warns that some interviewers mix background statements and the actual question in one long monologue. So while context helps the listener, the question must remain short and clear. So for example, sa ngayon ay 7 na ang panalo ng Cowboy team at sinasabi ng kanilang coach na sila ang magiging champion sa tournament na ito. Makakahabol pa ba ang inyong Rambo team? So this structure keeps context separate and lets the guest focus. So it's short and simple. So it doesn't give too much of the context, too much story before asking the question. So they ask the question directly right away. Okay, so separating statements from questions. Next, number 5, avoid statements posing as questions. So finally, from our text, it emphasizes that statements disguised as questions undermine clarity. These pseudo questions sound declarative rather than inquisitive, giving the impression that the interviewer already knows the answer. So, guidelines, so from the UF-IFAS extension in 2000, reinforce this, recommending that broadcast journalists use factual, open questions instead of rhetorical or hypothetical ones. So nothing too complicated. So when giving questions, for instance, so rather than saying, some people think your program has failed to reach its goals. So what are the goals, right? So instead you can say, how do you assess the progress of your program so far? So the goal is to open a dialogue and not deliver judgment. So effective questioning invites elaboration and insight, qualities that keep an audience engaged until the final sign-off. So the goal is to keep them engaged with answers to questions that are mostly on a positive note. So as much as possible. Okay. So based on the 5 principles that I've discussed here in my report, so the conclusion, so preparing questions for radio interviews demands both clarity and empathy. So the 5 principles, as well as the others from the other reporters, remain as essential today as they were decades ago. Modern research reinforces that well-crafted questions shape authentic dialogue, encourage reflection, and sustain audience trust. And so as development communicators, our job is not merely to extract answers, but to create understanding, especially for our listeners. Every question we ask is an opportunity to give voice to real people and their stories. So a good interviewer doesn't just talk, but he listens, frames, and connects. So the people, the community, and all the other stakeholders of the certain issue. And that has been my report. Now for my discussion points. So first, please share in our forum Have you ever heard a radio interviewer ask an uncomfortable or biased question? So, how did it make you feel as a listener? So, if possible, you can cite the exact radio program or the exact uh, interviewer or statement that you have heard. Next, number two, when you ask questions in daily life or in interviews, do you sometimes find yourself combining ideas, and would you agree that it is difficult to avoid? So those are my discussion points. So hope to see all your responses in the discussion forum, and thank you for listening to my report, and see you in the forums.